Well, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. For this portion, we thought that we'd pull in two distinguished scientists from really the edge of the world in one way or another to give you a sense of what's happening with climate change from the front lines. Max Holmes is the deputy director at Woods Hole Institute and is an Arctic scientist. And after this panel is over, you will be advised to get out of his way because he's going to sprint out of this building and go get on a flight to Anchorage, and he will be camping on the tundra tomorrow doing permafrost research. And Ruth Gates, who is a professor at the University of Hawaii, comes fresh from the coral reefs of Hawaii just 24 hours ago?
That's right, 48.
48 hours ago. So I want to start actually with the coral reefs. We hear, when we talk about the ocean and climate change, we hear quite a bit about sea level rise, in part because that's the thing that humans can most envision, I suspect. But what's happening with marine ecosystems themselves?
Well, I mean, marine ecosystems in general are suffering as the water warms and becomes more acidic with climate change. And so the coral reef specifically is a sentinel system that is threatened probably more than any other system. We estimate that we've already lost 50% of the world's reefs in the last 3 decades. And that loss is predominantly associated with warmer than normal waters. Corals live very, very close to their thermal threshold. And what we're seeing with the average increase in global temperature and excursions up and down around that mean in the summer and winter are conditions that corals just can't tolerate. And we've heard a lot about the Great Barrier Reef. I think in the last year, we estimate somewhere between 20 and 30% of the Great Barrier Reef was disturbed or damaged beyond repair last year.
Can you put some texture on that? When you say it was disturbed or damaged
Yes.
Beyond repair, what percentage of it was disturbed? And the parts that were damaged beyond repair, why were they damaged beyond repair? I mean, why can't they recover?
So what's interesting about temperature, we see that there are differences in the overall patterning of temperature in the ocean. And so last year and the year before, we had conditions on the northern Great Barrier Reef that were hotter than other areas of the Great Barrier Reef. And in the north, 67% of the reefs in the northern Great Barrier Reef did this thing called coral bleaching. And coral bleaching is really the paling of the usually brown coral tissues that is essentially a stress response. Like our fever is a stress response. Corals that go white as a result of exposure to, in this case, warm water, often die. And the conditions persisted for a long time, and the longer the coral is exposed, the more likely it is to die. So it's not an even distribution across the Great Barrier Reef, and it wasn't that the thermal anomalies were not evenly distributed throughout the Pacific, but it was considered to be a global bleaching event, and that means that there were huge numbers of reefs globally that were affected by these hotter than normal temperatures, the hottest ever on record.
Max, I want to bring you in. You are headed to the Arctic to dig up permafrost cores. And we're hearing a lot in the news right now about permafrost melting and melting more rapidly than it has previously. And I know there are some very serious dangers involved should all the permafrost in the Arctic melt. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. First, you slipped up a little bit when you introduced me, and I'm glad you did, because it gives me the opportunity to say a little bit about where I'm from. So I'm from the Woods Hole Research Center. There are actually several scientific institutions in Woods Hole. I'm at the Woods Hole Research Center, and I get to brag a little bit today because the announcement was made today that for the 4th year in a row, we've been named the world's #1 climate change think tank. Now, I don't even really know what a think tank is. And I don't think of us as a think tank. We're a bunch of scientists doing fundamental science, but we're all there because we care about, I'd say, shortening the gap between the science and hopefully its implementation for wise public policy. So, yeah, I will be tonight in Anchorage, tomorrow in Bethel, Alaska, which is in the Yukon River Delta, and the day after I'll hop on a float plane and I'll be with a group of 23 people camped out for 2.5 weeks in the tundra. And we're there because of the permafrost, which is permanently frozen ground. And we're there because permafrost has an awful lot of carbon in it, which may not stay there as the Earth warms and the Arctic warms and permafrost thaws. So a few numbers to put this into context. Right now, there are about 850 billion tons of carbon in the atmosphere. That's a hard number to wrap your head around, but just remember 850 billion tons. And that's about a 43% increase since 1850 when human activities started putting a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. In all the vegetation on Earth, there are about 500 billion tons of carbon. That's mainly in forests and trees. They store a lot of carbon. So 850 in the atmosphere, 500 in vegetation. Fossil fuels that are left in the ground that we could get out should we decide to continue down that road. So that's coal, oil, and natural gas are around 1,200 billion tons. And in permafrost, is permanently frozen ground, and it's sort of in quotes permanently frozen. The stuff that's in the Arctic, there are about 1,500 billion tons of carbon. So twice as much roughly as is in the atmosphere right now, 3 times as much as is in all vegetation on Earth, and more than that's in fossil fuels left in the ground. So the reason we should be thinking, when we think about what we should do about climate change, we think about fossil fuels, and we need to get off of fossil fuels in a hurry, and that's certainly true. I hope we think about tropical or deforestation, which is mainly happening in the tropics. We need to stop chopping down trees and let trees store carbon and restore forests where we can. The thing that hasn't gotten nearly as much attention, but I think should get more attention and should motivate us to act on the things we can act on is permafrost. Again, this vast stock of carbon locked up in frozen ground in the Arctic. It's built up over thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. But what's happening now is this freezer is essentially turning into a refrigerator. And just like in your home, if you had a bunch of food stored in your freezer, it's going to be there for a long time until your electricity goes out or until it turns into a refrigerator. And when that happens, that food rots, it decomposes, and in the process of rotting, it's releasing carbon dioxide and methane, which are greenhouse gases. So in the case of the Arctic, when permafrost thaws, these greenhouse gases are released, which causes more warming and more permafrost thaw, and on and on and on.
Max, I want to, that sounds like a very serious problem, but before we go on about that, I want to ask you, you said you're going to be camped out on the tundra. For those of us that grew up reading National Geographic, can you give us a more vivid sense of what that entails? And I asked because interviewing scientists for a living, sometimes they tend to romanticize it a bit. Like I've had people tell me that they were camped out at the South Pole, and then you go look at South Pole Station and it looks like a hotel in Aspen.
There'll be very few similarities with the Hotel Jerome where I'm staying now. And it's not like the South Pole, which actually, is pretty nice accommodations. We're in tents. We'll have 3 large tents. One will be a lab, one will be where we'll eat and have discussions, and one will be where food will be cooked. And then we'll be sleeping in tents, either 1 or 2 people per tent. As I said, there'll be like 24 of us, 14 students, 9 undergraduate students from around the country, 4 grad students, and a bunch of scientists. And even a journalist late in the game will show up. But it's, to me, it is an absolutely magnificent environment. I love being out there. It's incredibly beautiful. There's no trees. It's tundra. You can see forever and ever and ever. It's, as I already described, it's really important globally. You kind of forget the challenges sometimes, but you're quickly reminded when you get back there. And there are basically 2 choices. You can have wind and rain and cold at this time of year, maybe a few snowflakes and no mosquitoes, or some nice sunny weather and mosquitoes. And the mosquitoes are just absolutely insane.
And you've been going to the Arctic for 10, 15 years now. I don't want to age you up here. But give me a sense, is the changes that are happening there, are they visible to the naked eye? Is that something at the experience level that you see?
Yeah, you do. And certainly the residents of the Arctic, the people that live there and whose families have lived there for a long time, they see it. But as a scientist, well, we have lots of data to fall back on, and it's striking the changes you see, but you can see it over the, I don't know, I think I first went to the Arctic in '98, so what is that, almost 20 years, something like that. Yeah, the changes are apparent. It is happening. The ice is melting. The permafrost is thawing. On and on and on. You can see it.
Now, Ruth, you've been out on coral reefs for quite some time now, and is there a similar dynamic there? Like when you're going out there, do you go to the same spots and say, "Oh, last year, I remember this was this resplendent ecosystem, and now it's a wasteland"?
Certainly. I mean, I'm very lucky in my career in that I get to travel to some of the most extraordinary places that in the world that have coral reefs. And we have study sites in Australia, in American Samoa, in Japan, as well as really very detailed sites in Hawaii. And, the sad news is that almost every site that I visit is changed, and that change can manifest with a reduction in the number of fish, or in the three-dimensional complexity of the structure, or the reef just looking a bit fuzzy. And a healthy reef is a beautiful, pristine, clean, crisp place with many colors and a lot of movement. And so, it's just your overall sense of the place diminishing before your eyes. And of course, I've seen reefs that have been annihilated, and often annihilated by development and the burial of a reef because a hotel was built adjacent. So we have these big global problems that are, the warming, acidification, and sea level rise, but we also have this tension of human use and the very thing that people come to see being destroyed by the infrastructure that is required to support the tourist industry.
Yeah. You said something earlier about coral reefs being a sentinel marine ecosystem, and I wondered if you could unpack that a bit for us. Seagrass ecosystems, for instance, the effects that you're seeing in coral reefs, are those sort of one-to-one over on the seagrass, or are those more resilient?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, we often call the coral reefs the canary in the coal mine, because they are influenced by multiple climate change drivers. So we have ocean acidification, the changing of the chemistry as the CO2 dissolves into the ocean, that is impacting the ability of the corals themselves to lay down the skeletons that create the structure that we know as reefs. And then the warming that is diminishing the ability of the organism to survive and reproduce. And sea level rise, because the other two attributes are diminishing the capacity for the reef to grow. The reef is no longer keeping up with sea level rise. And that is a huge problem when you think that 97% of the storm energy that is rolling towards a landmass is often broken by the reef itself. It is the natural seawall. That is a stunning figure. Imagine the loss of that seawall. But when you look at a seagrass or a mangrove, they are not as sensitive to, say, ocean acidification. They'll be sensitive to warming, but not ocean acidification. And in fact, they are extremely good at keeping up with sea level rise. And so I always think of, corals are the triple whammy. Mangroves and seagrasses, maybe two of the three, or maybe only one of the three. But it's only a matter of time before the thing that they are most sensitive to exceeds threshold, and they are diminished in the way that coral reefs are currently diminishing.
You're someone who's been in touch with policymakers about this issue. Do you ever take these people out and show them? I think that there's no matter how, I sort of have a view that there aren't many people who actually are anti-science, even though that is something that gets thrown around a lot. But everyone kind of has a romantic feeling about coral reefs. And when you take people out to see these distressed reefs, what's their reaction?
Well, I think the thing is that even a diminished reef looks great.
Yeah.
So this is a difficult thing, right? It's only when you saw the reef before there was a disturbance and after the disturbance that you really understand the impact of the disturbance. And the reality is that today, so many reefs are in a poor state that, it's difficult to exemplify what has already been lost. But we do take our policymakers, in Hawaii specifically, out on the reef. We have underwater laboratories there where we're doing large-scale experimentation and expose them to the very thing and then point out, have you noticed there's not a single fish on this reef? Why do you think that is? Did you notice that this coral over here was, dark brown, and this one over here is just dead and decaying? So it's really by sort of highlighting the pieces that we need to watch and seeing their increasing prevalence on the reef that I think the policymakers get it. And also, we all learn so much by touching and feeling and seeing and smelling. I mean, that's experiential learning. That's what it's all about. So, but there's general alarm in the policy realm because we're talking about the loss of reefs as a sort of, the loss of reefs, but we're talking really about the loss of food security, coastal security, tourist economy, drugs that have yet to be discovered or are currently from the reef, and of course the entire balancing of the gases on the planet.
Max, you were saying, you were telling us earlier about this enormous carbon bomb that's underground in the Arctic. And I know all of that isn't going to, even in the worst projections, all of that is not going to melt overnight. But if you were to see a slow release of all that carbon over, say, the next century or 2 centuries, what would that mean? And I know that the modeling is quite tricky, but what kind of ranges would we be talking about temperature-wise?
Yeah, so right now, the Arctic, as I think I already said, is roughly in balance with respect to carbon, but it's tipping such that carbon is going to be released. The best estimate right now, and there's a range of estimates, but the best estimate right now is that over the remainder of this century, the average carbon release from the Arctic could be about 1.5 billion tons per year. And to put that number in perspective, the current emissions from all human activities in the U.S. are about 1.4 billion tons per year. So it's like we're adding another U.S. to the mix. So that's an awful, and that's a kind of a middle of the road. We could be surprised on either side, let's say. Maybe things will be better, but maybe things will be worse.
And what would that mean for temperatures?
Well, fundamentally what it means, I think, is it makes it really hard to, right now, if we get our act together with respect to controlling our use of fossil fuels and preserving forests, we can still, there's a huge range, I'd say, between the best case and the worst case scenario. We can make decisions with respect to, as I said, fossil fuels and deforestation, and that worst case is, the best case is not good, but it's not so terrible. We can live with it. Coral reefs have a hard time living with it, unfortunately. But once permafrost thaw starts happening in a big way and picking up and releasing its carbon, it gets, that best case scenario gets a lot worse, let's say.
And Ruth, if we were to see 2, 3 centigrade, or Celsius rather, warming, which is plausibly in range, what would that mean for coral reefs?
It's curtains for coral reefs. There is no way that corals can withstand those temperatures. We, for the Paris meeting, we put together a consensus statement from the organization that is the society where all coral reef scientists are housed. And the statement was that if we fail to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees, that the majority of the world's reefs will be dead by 2050. 2050. When we do climate change adaptation for reefs, we're always talking about the 2100 mark, and I keep saying, we don't have that 50 years to talk about. We shouldn't be thinking about past 2050. In fact, we should be thinking about adaptation in the next 10 years if we hope to have reefs past 2050. It's so urgent and so imminent a crisis. And, when you think that 25% of the world's fish species are thought to live at some point or other on a coral reef, the impact of food security is extraordinarily unpredictable. It's not just the people who rely on the food in their place. We estimate that 70% of the protein in some Pacific islands comes directly from the reef. It's not just those people, it's everybody in the world will be impacted in terms of the lack of fish that would have been housed by the reef.
So what are people outside of mitigating fossil fuel emissions and other climate change mitigation strategies. What are people doing at the reef level?
You know, we're discussing things that are considered to be extremely controversial. Things like genetically directing the system, selective breeding. In fact, my own program is starting to walk down that road of how do we breed the strongest corals that are surviving conditions that are currently killing others. What do we do to actually do temporary relief to the stressors at critical times? So if we have very high temperatures in midsummer, we know that a coral reef that is very heavily flushed with water will do better than a reef that is in very stagnant water. So can we introduce a huge amount of flow across a reef? Or a reef that is shaded from direct sunlight will do better than a reef that is in direct sunlight. Can we shade portions of the reef? I mean, this is, we are talking about intervening in ways that we would never have considered 20 or 30 years ago. In fact, I had nothing to do with this kind of work when I came up. I was fascinated by the corals themselves and their ability to do the things that they do, to create these extraordinary places. And here I am, taking all of this basic science forward into the how do we solve the problem while we get our act together to mitigate fossil fuel burning.
Did you have an initial reaction to that when it became clear that intervention, that actually, I mean, can you imagine putting shades over coral reefs? I mean, there's something that's sort of initially revolting about that idea, but we do want to keep the reefs around. Did you have an emotional reaction to that at first?
It's deeply disturbing to me that we're at this place. I mean, I you know, often will say, look, it makes me want to stick a pencil in my eye that we're at this point in time with reefs. You know, we have pushed beyond the sort of, let's put a marine protected area in and let's manage human behavior in this space. And we know that because the Great Barrier Reef is the best managed ecosystem in the world. And we lost a huge portion of it last year because the conditions just exceeded all of the benefits that are acquired by this sort of management of the human activities in a place. I'm not saying that that's a bad way forward. We should be protecting every ecosystem that is threatened by climate change at this point. But now having to add this added layer of what are the solutions? You know, the mitigation, the local mitigation of ocean acidification with addition of bases, cloud brightening to reflect the radiation away from the ocean. I mean, all of these things are now in discussion. We are moving into intervention to adapt the system until we get our act together. Because we recognize for coral reefs, the polar ice sheet, it's too late.
Max, how do you feel about direct interventions of that sort?
The same way. I mean, I hate to go there. I hate that we're in the position where we need to think about these things and discuss them, but we're at that point. And I mean, you know, in the reef example, would you rather lose the reef or do something drastic and save them? You could think of analogous things in the Arctic and with permafrost. We cannot afford, humanity cannot afford to lose permafrost because of all the carbon that's going to go to the atmosphere. So you get to the point where you think about doing some really drastic things that are almost crazy ideas, but we may get there. We are getting there. I want to be so somebody says this. There's going to be a film screening tonight of Chasing Coral. I saw that maybe 6 weeks ago, a month ago, or something like that. It's a brilliant film. It's not particularly uplifting, but I think it's really powerful. Ruth is featured prominently. I saw the film with my family. I hadn't met Ruth before that. We all fell in love with her. So my kids think I'm really cool now because I'm on this panel with Ruth.
That's embarrassing.
I want to leave a little time so we can hear some questions from our audience. But before I do that, is it possible, and this is a truly bleak scenario even to contemplate, but that if coral reefs are that endangered by, say, 2 degrees warming, that they might end up being not just a canary in the coal mine, like an inspiration where people say, wow, if we've lost the reefs, something very serious is going on and we need to make a drastic change in how we live.
The sacrificial system.
Yeah.
You know, it's the idea that we need to push our planet so close to an edge to react and respond to commit to actually solving a problem that we actually know how to solve. It's just mind-blowing to think about it. We know that it's not like, renewable energy is so easy to move towards. It's economically viable, it's clean, it's fun. Why are we fighting the edge? Why are we having to push up? And let's be real, we are just the next in line. It's a house of cards. Coral reefs are the first card to go down. The rainforests are going down. The ice sheets are going to go down. It's a house of cards. And guess what? We are in line, and we will not be the last species on the planet. If we don't do it for the ecosystems and nature, the environment, do it for ourselves. Do it for future generations of us, if that's what makes us motivate to get it done. But we got to get it done.
Yeah. I want to take questions from our audience. I see. Oh, hand went right up right here. We've got right here. Sorry.
So I look at Donald Trump, I look at Putin, I look at the leaders of these countries, and I don't see how this happens. I don't see one of them saying anything that doesn't say, I want more from my side.
Yeah, it's worth wondering whether we can get Putin on one of his little macho outings he likes to do out to a coral reef or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I do think the one thing that we can, action happens from the ground. We are all responsible for what we do in this sphere, and every single person. Collectively, if we all do something, something will change. We can push and push with our legislators. It's not just the very top of the chain. That influences what countries do. And I think that, the fact that Trump isn't on this agenda is a rally for all of us to act in ways that are perhaps more influential than we would have ever thought would be needed. But we can get it done.
Yeah, my perspective on, the title of this session has something to do with the Paris Climate Agreement, and I think it's absolutely shameful that the U.S. has pulled out. I think it tremendously damages our position as a global leader, but I can imagine a scenario where it may actually be good for the Earth's climate, or better than the U.S. staying in and dragging its feet. And I think we're seeing some signs that other nations are stepping up and may take a leadership position as the U.S. pulls back. China, for example, and it can be lots of other countries as well. States are stepping up, cities are stepping up, individuals are stepping up. And so the reaction to the U.S. pulling out of the climate agreement, my hope, will be stronger than the direct impact of us pulling out. I don't know that that's going to happen, but that's what I hope for.
Gentleman right here.
Thanks, and thank you both for the work you're doing. I run a conference called FIRE, and we've spent a lot of time looking at these problems. We tried to recruit Congress, they were useless. And then we decided to do it ourselves. So we actually have been working with 5 national laboratories for a solution set. And these things get so depressing when you talk about them. I thought I would just mention that there is a solution set. And I agree completely with what Ruth said. The peril isn't 50 years from now. Even if we do the very best things with all the right moves in renewables, we have about a 25-year or 30-year period when the whole thing gets screwed up. We might not survive that part of the story. So we have to do something very quickly that will bring gigatons of carbon back down from smokestacks and from the atmosphere. And we think that there's a way to do it. And there's a website called carbontrifecta.org. And the idea is to make a business of it, to make money from it, to have everybody work together instead of fighting each other, and turn CO2 into the most valuable material in the world, which is graphene, and then make very valuable products out of that and print cities, literally print cities out of that stuff, because you have to print gigatons a year. But it is doable. So I think that, just to add a little optimism to this conversation, there is a way out of this thing, I think.
I didn't hear a question there, so I'm going to move on to another question right behind there.
Let me just quickly follow up on that. So I think, yeah, in addition to stopping putting the carbon into the atmosphere, we need to pull it out. There can be technological fixes like were just described that may help us out. We can also plant trees.
Hi, Lizette Cooper. I have a question about the permafrost. You said there were 1,500 billion tons of carbon in the permafrost. And if that thaws, what percentage of it do you think might be released into the atmosphere? And what's the threshold that you think would cause that to happen?
Those are the questions that we work on all the time. Those are the questions that I'll be in the field for the next couple of weeks studying. Maybe 10% could be lost over the remainder of this century. That's a ballpark figure. More would be lost later. There's no single threshold because permafrost is at all different temperatures around the Arctic. Some of it is right around the thaw point right now. And in fact, in the Yukon River Delta where we're going, one of the reasons we're going there, it's warm permafrost, so it's really vulnerable. It's close to that thaw point, which means it's going to be some of the first stuff to go. Other permafrost may be at minus 15 degrees Celsius, so it can handle a few degrees of warming without totally being lost. So there are different thresholds, or there's no single threshold. But yeah, as a ballpark, we could lose 10% over the next century, but it won't stop there. It will accelerate beyond that time frame.
What are we here? Sure.
Hello. You raised a very interesting question about why is it so hard to get people to focus on climate change now, and that's something that's perplexed me. And the best reason I've come up with is that you're asking people to pay a hard cost today for an unclearly defined benefit in the future.
Yeah.
And that's economically challenging, even though to some of us it may be more clearly defined. But my question is, in terms of the best case scenario is having a transition, because we'd all love to wave a magic wand and get rid of fossil fuels tomorrow, but we can't put the world's largest economies in reverse. So you need a transition plan with the less carbon intensive fossil fuels. So I'd love to hear your idea on how we should do that and what the percentages should be of the less intensive fossil fuels as we transition to renewables.
Want to start?
No, I can't.
Yeah, I mean, just so at the point that renewable energy becomes equal or less than fossil fuel-based energy, things change dramatically. Right now, subsidies are needed, although there are major subsidies for the fossil fuel industry as well. A guy that I've interacted with a bit is Bob Inglis. So he, as he puts it, so he was a congressman from the most conservative district of the most conservative state, very conservative Republican from South Carolina. Yeah, and he would win in landslides for a number of elections, and then his kids became of voting age. And as he tells the story, well, two things. One, he visited Antarctica, and two, his kids became of voting age. I think his son came to him, I think, and said, "Dad, I'm with you on most things here, but you got to get right on this climate change issue." And as he describes it, all I needed to hear about all I needed to know about climate change was that Al Gore said it was a problem, so throw that out. But he listened to his kid. He studied. He absorbed the science and accepted. All right, this is something we need to do something about. And it was an absolutely horrible career decision because he said that during the next election. Instead of winning 70-30, he lost 70-30. But I guess where I was going with that, Bob Inglis is no longer an elected official, but he is working on in an organization that's working on sort of conservative solutions to climate change. And they basically advocate for removing all subsidies from either the fossil fuel industry or the renewable energy, letting them compete on an even basis, but also taxing carbon emissions, and he thinks that's the solution. And I like that a lot because we need to get more people on board, and so that's a good one. Other elements of that right now, so I just put solar on my house, and I will generate more electricity than I use. And that was possible for a number of reasons, including incentives that made it feasible to put this very nice, well, lots of incentives that developed the technology to have these solar panels that would do the job, and then incentives that made it economically viable for me to do that in Massachusetts. So there are a million different solutions. The technologies are there. They're getting better all the time. They're becoming cost competitive, and we just got to keep the incentives, keep the pressure on, and greatly accelerate the speed at which we make that transition.
All right, let's go one more question, and then we got to get Max up to Alaska. Right here.
A comment and a question. I've been to Antarctica, and there was a time when I went there, they had limited the number of boats that could go and passengers. I don't know if that's still being done. Would that be at all helpful? I was recently in Australia, went to the Great Barrier Reef, and was shocked that it was white. And we went in a little boat that submerged. Are we causing more harm to it by visiting it the way we are? Is kind of a general question. But the other overall question is, I think the masses of people are kind of confused because we get different scientific reports, and there's not anything concise. Now, I know about the Great Barrier Reef because I've seen it, and I know about Antarctica because I've seen it. But a lot of people don't have the opportunity to see with their own eyes. Where is there any kind of consensus to make it clear to the average person so that each individual could do something to help?
So I think your point is extremely well taken. And, we've been doing science on reefs, and we've been documenting the declines for years and years, and we've been talking almost exclusively to ourselves. The science community has bandied these figures around, and we really don't understand why the world doesn't get it, right? It's just not good enough. So, the film that we're going to see tonight, that is a great example of translating the information in a way that people can absorb it and act upon it. And I think we are in a time when scientists have to render information in a variety of different ways that target different audiences who will absorb it depending on their proclivities. And it's really, at the same point that we need to have a diversified portfolio of messages that are going out to very many different audiences to try and get people on the same page, but not necessarily with exactly the same set of words. So I think that there's been a call to action to the science community to be much more vocal, much more visible, and in fact, advocate. I always describe myself, I'm a passionate advocate for coral reefs. Well, my scientist colleagues say, it's not our job to advocate. It is our job. We cannot lose coral reefs. We cannot. And if I die screaming those words and talking about the facts that are behind those words, then that's what it'll be. But at least we tried to inform a much broader audience about these problems. And the ocean is a particularly difficult one because really from above it just looks like a deep, dark chasm. And there's so much going on in there, and we depend so fundamentally on the health of the ocean to be healthy ourselves.
Max, Ruth, thanks for being with us today. This is wonderful. Thank you.
So it's worth taking a breath. Everyone, literally, that's a heavy load. And, I'm sure many of you know a lot of that science, and that was just a tiny taste of the science, right? We didn't really talk about sea level. Didn't really talk about species beyond reefs and the Arctic. This is an issue that is the most integrated challenge that the world has ever faced in many ways. And it's not an understatement to say that. I'm Andy Revkin, by the way. I write for ProPublica.org, the nonprofit investigative newsroom. I joined the staff there in December after 21 years writing for the New York Times about climate, the environment, disaster risk reduction, 9/11, tsunamis. There's lots going on this planet. I've been writing about climate change since the mid-1980s, since before the IPCC, since before COP1. Remember, COP21 was Paris. The COP0 essentially was Rio in 1992, Conference of the Parties to this framework convention. And I'm just going to give you a very quick taste of my own learning curve because it's relevant to where we're going to go here. And I started out, remember, 1980s, we did some really good things with pollution, right? The Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. So when this came around, and it's been an issue in the literature for over 100 years. Actually, if you really go back, it's much longer than that. But it really became a story 30 years ago, well, 29 years ago. Next year, June of 1988, Jim Hansen, a scientist, gave this testimony in front of a Senate hearing chaired by Tim Wirth from the good state of Colorado. And Jim said, you know, we have a perceptible impact on the climate system. But then we had just done this stuff with the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, so all of us, including journalists, kind of assumed, okay, this is a pollution problem. So we just need to regulate it and it'll kind of go away. And it took a while for it to sink in that the drivers of climate change are much more profound and the solutions are much more complicated than sticking a filter on a smokestack for sulfur and sticking a catalytic converter on a car tailpipe. Energy is still primarily produced by fossil fuels. It's still over 80% of the world's global energy menu now, and in 2030 is predicted to be from fossil fuels because of the growing appetite for energy in countries that are under-energized. So it's bigger than a pollution problem. And so I thought, okay, then what is it? Well, then it's a political problem. We all thought it was a political problem. And in the 1990s, I started writing about the politics behind Kyoto Protocol. The fights in the industry was getting engaged on this the way they used to with tobacco. And so you think, okay, well, we just need to stifle them, and then on we go. And then it became clear, again, it's bigger than a pollution problem. This morning, we talked about the technological challenges, Varun Sivaran, and how do you get a renewable economy, energy economy from where we are now. So it became clear it's bigger than a political problem. So then you think, okay, diplomatic problem. We did the Montreal Protocol in 1987, 30 years ago this year. CFCs, ozone-eating chemicals, you know, the stuff that Trump thinks doesn't really happen either, because he was inconvenienced about the hairspray aspect of it. There's somewhere online, there's a tweet about that from a long time ago. So, but we passed a treaty, you know, there was a chemical, we all agreed globally, rich countries and poor countries, you know, rich would go first, poor would get a little bit of breathing space. So you think it's a diplomacy problem. 1992, Rio. And from Rio to Copenhagen in 2009, there was still this expectation that we could do something like we did with Montreal Protocol. There was this expectation you could have this top-down targets and timetables and some kind of punitive element. And that went away in Copenhagen when Obama went there, and it all kind of fell apart. And then came Paris. Paris is a great achievement and a complete capitulation to the scope of the problem. And when I wrote about it for the Times, it's literally like Dickens, the best of times. It was the best of treaties and the worst of treaties, because it gets everybody into the game. Every country on Earth pledged to do something, but it was non-binding. So long to that old formula of the top-down rescue approach. You know, rescue us from ourselves isn't going to work. And the interesting thing about Paris, and we'll talk about this, is it's the first time in this whole process from 30 years when the world's countries agreed, you know, that what we're going to do here is not like a contract. It wasn't a treaty that you sign and then, you know, lawyers vet it and make sure it's all hunky-dory. It was an agreement to take a journey together for the rest of the century. It was the start of something. It wasn't the end of something. And now what that thing is highly uncertain. And then Trump comes along like an asteroid collision, goes boom, and everything is disrupted. You know, you look around, we'll talk about this right now, what do we do? The idea of what's the agenda? What has happened that's permanently damaged because of what the president has done? What's the smallness of it and what's the bigness of it? And what do you do going forward on resilience, on climate, on energy transitions? So that's where we're going to go here. I wanted to start with quick introductions, and we're going to go down the line, and we'll have room for some questions from you. So Alice Hill was on the National Security Council under President Obama, working very hard on a resilience policy that could make sure that America going forward, and considering its international interests, have a world That's where you know you're not going to get those, uh-oh, why didn't we think of that moments. And how do you build a resilience in the face of uncertainty, of which there's lots, rate of sea level rise, all kinds of things remain uncertain. So we'll talk about that. Bina Venkataraman was at the White House also. How long did you?
We worked together. I was lucky enough to get to work with Alice.
Right, but Bina is mainly a writer now and a policy analyst. She had a brief stint at the New York Times in the science section when I was still in the news staff, and you're now at the New America. So it's not the New America Foundation now; it's New America.
Renamed New America to not give the impression that we're a philanthropy, and
yes,
also
that's
at MIT.
Yeah. And here, of course, David Mansma, how long have you been doing this particular thing for Aspen, for the Institute?
11 years.
11 years. I got to meet David long ago when I first started coming out here. So David Mansma is Aspen Institute's maven on climate and energy. So I guess we'll start with that asteroid collision, the Trump, whatever you want to name it. What did that feel like to you? And then how long did it take for you to kind of recalibrate and figure out how much of that was meaningful and how much of that doesn't matter?
Well, it was the evening before the announcement was about to occur. And I don't think I've ever been quite as engaged in my professional life as that evening, when I thought of the thousands of hours of effort that had been put into getting to Paris. We've now heard it's not thousands, it's many more, tens of thousands of hours, through decades. And that this would be pulled. I was deeply afraid because of the urgency we've heard from Ruth. This is not 2100. The impacts are right outside here in your bark beetle infestation in Colorado, your droughts, your wildfires. U.S. will not be exceptional. We will receive and already are receiving these impacts. So to have the president pull the plug on this sent a message to the United States that this was not an urgent problem, and most importantly to the rest of the world, and pulled us all back. I think that we have not gotten up to speed yet. We will see that the federal government will not be a major player for the immediate future in the world of combating climate. We now see many other players stepping up. It reminds me a little bit of Let a Thousand Flowers Bloom. So we're having cities, states, NGOs, all redoubling their efforts to cut emissions. And that is fabulous. But I don't think it can get us where we need to go if we don't also have the efforts that take a national approach, including the science. So you couple the budget cuts with the message from the Trump administration as to deep uncertainty in their belief that climate change is occurring, and then the rapidity of the impacts, and it's very distressing. It is, in my opinion, a major setback, and has allowed other countries, notably China and India, to have an opportunity to lead in a space that the U.S. Was already strongly in a leadership position. I think our allies deeply regret us stepping off the world stage at this moment. So that's my cheery message.
Yeah. Can you, and then Bina, you can fill in any blanks. Can you give a quick snapshot of what the resilience strategy was?
I think he's asking you first.
Yeah.
Well, we took a look, and this came up. There was a question as to whether there is a document that describes our risks that's a consensus document. Federal government issued that document in 2014. 300 scientists reached consensus as to what's contained in that report. Executive summary, word for word, was agreed to by 300 experts in this field. And I will just ask you to pause and think about consensus in your own life. When you have to reach consensus on something, what does that mean? It's probably conservatively stated, which has, in fact, been true. We've already outpaced the prediction. It's the third National Climate Assessment. Wonderful interface online. You can go to this region, for example, and learn what the impacts are and what they're projected to be. Regional impacts on infrastructure, everything. energy systems, biological impacts, health impacts, to better inform yourselves of the risk. Our resilience looked at flood, number one, really damaging risk. We're already seeing record-breaking events all the time. First 4 months of this year, we had 15 $1 billion damage events. So we need to address flood. We did a federal flood risk management standard. We did drought planning. We did extreme heat planning. We set standards for non-climate earthquakes. We've set standards for wildfires to better prepare the nation to withstand these risks. President Trump has indicated that he is pulling back on some of these, including preparations, and this is the most ironic of all, of our national security apparatus to be prepared for the impacts across the globe as they hit populations with, we've heard today, food insecurity, water insecurity, and the migrations that will follow. And he's instructed that we no longer be involved in that. In my opinion, that poses huge risks. But that was our resilience agenda, and we're hoping that some of it can remain in place.
So Bina, from what I understand of your White House tenure, you were also focused on community. Let's call it community organizing, meaning corporate community. Can you describe that and also the energy plans that were underway?
Sure. So a lot of my work was focused on building partnerships with the private sector around information sharing to prepare for the impacts of climate change, but also to try to build commitments from the private sector, from companies, from communities as well, to take actions with respect to purchasing of renewable energy. So you've seen a lot of companies now make pledges, some 23 Fortune 500 companies, some 80 plus companies in the country have, global companies, I should say, have made pledges to go 100% renewable. Some of that work, I think, the Obama administration collectively can take credit for, but also partnerships and commitments to address the aspects around how do you prepare your supply chain for the risks of extraordinary heat waves or droughts? How do we think about protecting the breadbaskets of America? And to some degree, the idea behind that was to build support for actions that are needed to bring us into more parity in terms of renewables and fossil fuel-based energy. And I will say that one silver lining, I share Alice's view that this is dire for US leadership in particular, for us to be stepping away from Paris. I share her view that the federal government and the lever of the federal government is critical for addressing this problem. But I do think that the silver lining is this incredible ferment we're seeing coming from the private sector, from the cities and states in response to Trump's decision to pull us out of Paris. You're seeing it in a movement called We Are Still In, which is being shepherded by Michael Bloomberg. It started with statements and pledges, but now, from what I understand, a little bit of having talked to some of the people involved, they're building that into concrete commitments whereby companies will say how much their ambition of reductions are going to be, what states are going to make certain commitments. The calculations are going to be a little bit tricky. There's going to be some overlap in who's making emissions reductions where, but that momentum is really important. And I have always felt that while the public sector and the lever of policy is important, that if we didn't have a sustained concern and real actual skin in the game on the part of the private sector and part of communities in addressing this problem, that the effort wasn't going to be sustainable. And I think that what we're seeing now in reaction to Trump's decision, in fact, it might end up being more enduring in terms of policy and political support. We're seeing a bipartisan coalition come together around the carbon dividend and tax plan. That said, the timing of this is kind of unfortunate because we are in a situation where we are seeing the warmest years on records, 2014, 2015, 2016, billion-dollar weather and climate disasters, the melting of the Arctic, severe national security threats from this problem. So it would have been nice to have seen this bipartisan and sort of corporate sector movement earlier, but it's still important that it's happening now.
So David, you're in a position kind of like a journalist where you get to kind of keep track. How many people come through here and talk about climate or carbon taxes or population growth, and you're sort of vetting and sifting and listening. What's your sense of what's not on the table that or being under-explored or that you feel really has a sense of true momentum?
Well, what Bina just said, and Alice both, is completely accurate kind of assessment, both looking back and looking forward. We do have about 4 or 5 energy forums here at the Aspen Institute, so there's about 400 energy and climate experts who come through here every summer. It's about herding cats or foxes or dogs, depending. They're all of very different perspectives. So the sectors are different in their response to this. Their solution sets in response to new announcements from the White House are different. This summer, we'll hear a lot more about that response, so it's kind of stay tuned. My sense is that, as Bina's pointed out, that I wasn't shocked, I wasn't surprised. I was dismayed over the many hours and the amount of work that has gone into trying to get the world to agree on some path, some journey, as you call it. We have a Track 2 dialogue with Beijing on climate change and WRI. We have a Track 2 dialogue with Delhi in India on climate change. And we spent 5 years in those meetings trying to help keep things in line so that when Paris came along, there was a greater likelihood of success among really top 3 leaders, China, US, and India. And it worked. I think there's a lot of work from all around that went into that, including the private sector. But I think the thing that maybe doesn't get talked about sometimes in this discussion that maybe we're privy to a little bit, is that let's deal with that reality and let's try to remain in the realm of realism. The amount of investment and the amount of capital that has gone into renewable energy and other types of clean technology over the last 10 years, partly because of the ITC and the PTC, the incentives, but also now as a part of business, is really at that and the orientation of the cities and mayors and governors that are probably already focused on meeting that Paris Agreement. We're going to meet our target, our NDC, our nationally determined contribution to Paris without the White House. That's going to happen. And I agree really strongly with what Bina just said here. Maybe it's a perverse consequence, but we are now going to turn a corner. There has been more discussion about climate change in the last 6 months than there has in the last 6 years in a way that I think is more accessible, a little more understandable, and we have to play to that. The decision on Paris, the decision this week on Energy Week, the things that are happening right now as we're sitting here regarding the investment in R&D and ARPA-E, the things that we need government to do and continue to do, that's unfortunate, but I don't see it really as, it's really not a anti-climate or it's a bizarre ideology. It's coming out of the wee hours of the morning. It's not really logical. It's not fundamental to any perspective. And so I think reacting and trying to understand that and make reason with it isn't going to work. There are enough people in the career parts of the government who have been working on this for a long time. There are enough people even within the administration who have to look and see how things are going to be balanced, that we're going to have to remain vigilant about the things that we have been doing and the things that we have to continue to do on both the private sector, economic levels, on the climate management levels. But vigilance is going to count here, and probably more than it ever has. The next 2 or 3 years is going to be very difficult and very awkward, and I think somewhat embarrassing. But at the same time, I think the economy is now moving towards a very early stage of sector-wide, economy-wide decarbonization. It's the beginning, and it's a rough start. It's a bumpy takeoff, and it just got bumpier. But that's where we are, and we have to remain in the pilot seat there.
So I'm going to turn the lens a little bit away from Trump because I did some reporting for ProPublica in the last couple of months in 2 different pieces on what you said bears out in the reporting. Carbon, the biggest wind development in the United States right now is in a Carbon County, Wyoming, a state named for the coal under the ground. And it's not because they were ordered, someone was ordered to go to wind there. There's an opportunity there to send electricity to the hungry cities of the Southwest as they boost their air conditioning. But that's the sort of Trump doesn't matter so much part. But there's the other part of the Trump doesn't matter so much part, which is this is a way bigger problem than Trump. And I worry sometimes that the politics is so juicy, not just to us in the media, but to activists and advocates, that we missed some other things that are going on. Like just a month ago in ProPublica, right around the time Trump pulled out of Paris, I wrote a piece where I noted that I was at the Sustainable Energy for All Forum in New York City in April, and a European Union official there was excitedly telling me how Europe had successfully lobbied the Trump administration to fast-track exports of natural gas from a new terminal in Texas to Europe. Natural gas from all the shale-derived, fracking-derived fields in America that's now plentiful. So Europe, you know, a lot of people said, Trump, 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 oh my God, Europe is our savior. How does that square? There's a huge amount, journalistically, I see layers of hypocrisy out there that worry me. Alice, I don't know if you think about those contexts. You know, obviously, we want to ship natural gas to Europe so they're not reliant on Putin. And this is all part of the fact that climate is like just one of the issues on the table at any one moment in time. So what do you think about that stuff? If you were the NSC and I came in and said, and actually Europe was lobbying Obama too to do the same thing, how do you kind of square that with Europe's statements on climate and that kind of thing?
Well, I think everyone wants energy security, and certainly natural gas is viewed as part of the transition. That was part of Obama's very firm view on this, that it was an all of the above until we were able to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. So it's not surprising what has occurred. I think for me, we will continue to work to decarbonize our economy. The resilience side, and Ruth sat in this chair and could not have said it more articulately, that we are highly vulnerable, our health, our economy, our security, to what's happening. To lose that discourse and really have centralized ideas as to what to do, it's all regional and local decisions, but we can't expect a small town on the Gulf to figure out what kind of seawall they should build, or whether it's mangoes or whatever, to deal with the saltwater intruding and flooding all the time. And so what we've done is leave communities vulnerable to what will undermine their ability to thrive. And that, I think, is a very serious challenge, because that work is not continuing at this moment right now in the federal government in as deep a way as it was started. So communities will have to figure this out on their own, which they don't typically have the science or the tools downscaled to their needs to be able to do that yet.
And another aspect of that is, and I'm going to ask you about this in a second, when you split off the vulnerability issue from the emissions needs, you know, reducing emissions, it's the one area where you can do something right now that has an impact right now, meaning a change in zoning so that there's a disincentive to build in a flood zone. We started to have that with rational flood insurance costs that was bipartisan when this bigger waters bill that was raising the cost of flood insurance, it was bipartisan, it got through this polarized Congress, and then it got undone when communities realized, oh my God, our insurance rates are going up. Democrats and Republicans pressured their Congress people to roll it back. So,
it's up for reauthorization now.
Yeah.
$24 billion in the hole, and it's up for reauthorization.
But here's the deal, like you mentioned wildfires. The main driver of vulnerability to wildfires right now in the West is growth in what's called the wildland-urban interface, which we are surrounded by here. You are in the WUI, W-U-I. And the rate of growth there is happening. The building of vulnerability into these fire-prone areas is happening way faster than any known impact of climate change itself. So there's a thing right now where local communities, if they had the politics, could act. Bina, do you want to get at this?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say that this is actually a fiscal conservative issue, and
right.
Alice talks about this as well. But, you know, there's a study from the National Institute of Building Sciences that shows that $1 spent in hazard mitigation, natural disaster hazard mitigation, whether you want to call climate change natural disaster or man-made disaster, it still kind of belongs in the category, these incidents like wildfires and droughts. That $1 spent in that saves about $4 in disaster relief. And that study is it predates this new era we've entered into of $15, $16 billion extreme events, price tags. in a world of warming climate and also of this demographic concentration in areas that are particularly vulnerable to climate impacts. So that's probably a lower estimate of the actual spending, and economists are now looking at this and saying it's about $1 spent in hazard mitigation. It saves about $15 in disaster relief. So that's an issue that communities and thinking about budgets, the federal government and thinking about budgets, should be able to rally behind and sort of it stands outside of the politics of cutting emissions. So I think that in some ways is a very positive sort of route for messaging around political rallying. That said, what we're seeing happening right now with the federal budget does not reflect that at all. It was, and frankly, in the last administration, either, you could see like something like a cent on the dollar being spent on mitigation versus relief. And so I think that that's something where we could build a lot of consensus. But I did want to say something about your earlier point about the sort of the geopolitics of natural gas and how watching the Trump ball might be something of a decoy at times, not necessarily intentional. But I was in Japan for the anniversary of Fukushima on 3/11. And it's so fascinating to me because Japan went from the country that was hosting the Kyoto Protocol, the leader in a lot of these climate conversations, to now being a very fossil fuel intensive economy. So they had 54 working reactors at the time of 3/11, the meltdown of Fukushima, and now they have 4 operating nuclear reactors. And there's the whole transition with nuclear that's coming is part of the strategic landscape when we think about energy. The plants in the 70s and 80s that have been established in this country and Europe are going to be decommissioned in the next 3 to 4 years. And the safety risks and costs of building new nuclear capacity are so high that we're unlikely to replace that. And what's happened in Japan, I feel like, is somewhat of a harbinger for what could be happening elsewhere. And in the midst of this, part of what has happened with Shinzo Abe and Trump's rekindled relationship, post-election, is that they're trying to make arrangements to get more of our LNG so that they can have more energy independence from the Asia-Pacific region. But again, that's important for the transition. The natural gas is important for the transition, but it's not building capacity in renewables. It's not actually getting us to a place where we're actually at a low-carbon future.
I want to just stay on the vulnerability thing one more second and ask you, are there voices you think should be integrated more in here that could get at this? We heard there about there's a lot of commonality when you look. You can have conservatives or libertarians for sure who don't want to have the government paying off someone because they built a house in a stupid place. So Headwaters Economics, which is based out here, I've written about fire policy and some of these other disaster risk reduction areas where it seems so many things that from that angle synchronize with what you would want from Obama administration angle.
Well, I want to comment on the energy and the nuclear, but to answer your question, I think that there's clearly, this is all happening at a time of tremendous growth, even in the United States. In fact, it's an economic growth, and in the West, there's a tremendous amount. Colorado is burgeoning. There's 0 housing vacancies in Denver, right? The inventory is very low.
Is it true that it's because of legalized marijuana? Someone told me that yesterday.
Beautiful weather.
Just kidding.
So there is a local element. There's a urban, rural interface here that we're going to lose some of the policy truck on. I mean, one of the things about the last 8 years, I have to say, is that the administration, the Obama administration, had so many brilliant people working on so many different levels of this, including this question, both resilience, adaptation, and the landform in terms of our ability to continue to have economic growth. And to continue to have economic growth and decouple it from carbon buildup. And that's the key here, and that's where we're going to have a gap, at least maybe from the leadership from the White House. On the other hand, we do have to kind of remain aware, highly aware, vigilant again. Later on, I think here, Ted Halstead and the Climate Leadership Council are going to talk a little bit about their carbon dividend. We've got to listen for opportunities that maybe we didn't expect or wouldn't have anticipated that might have more of an ability to communicate with this government, with this administration. At the same time, they're denying things, or like yesterday, I think President Trump said that renewable energy was a mistake, some things like that. So I think that, but to tie that to the nuclear and energy mix, he also used the opportunity yesterday to talk about a commitment to nuclear energy. And so on, Michael Shea and Colin Jost from Saturday Night Live were here with Chris Matthews, and they made the kind of comment that if you're a conservative, you can kind of say anything, and people would say, oh, that's interesting. But if you're a liberal and you say something outside of the track, out of the lane, you'll get killed. And it's true. So there are some disconformities within the overall progressive renewable energy. 100% renewable is not the goal. There is going to be a diversity of the fuel mix, particularly over the next 15 or 20 years. That's going to come from investments both at a private sector level, at a state and municipal level, but also there will be a need to think hard about what are we going to do with the remaining nuclear fleet that we have, which is zero emissions. At the same time, China and the rest of the world will bring on a lot of megawatts of nuclear energy, and we're going to have the brain power and the national security perspective to understand how do we deal with that. Well, we can't deal with it if we're not doing it. So there's some aspect of that. Natural gas, I know on one side there's the concern for getting locked in to the fossil fuel CO2 emissions from natural gas, but it is the one thing that has not regulation. It is the one thing that has pushed out coal and has a lot of synergies with renewable energy. And the utilities around this country are now figuring out how to do distributed energy resource management so that you can have both renewables using gas and other ways to intermittently keep the lights on, which is what we have to do over the time period that we decarbonize.
So I'm going to take this to yet another level. I think the nuclear issue always brings up something we talked about this morning, which is the cultural divisions in which people with different worldviews or backgrounds look at the same science and come out with completely divergent conclusions, whether it's climate change or the role of nuclear power. And culturalcognition.net is a very interesting Yale research initiative that gets at this, which among other things, was existentially challenging to a journalist and a lot of my science friends who, because it says basically information mostly doesn't matter. It says that this room is kind of a self-selected room, but in the average population, there'll be an edge pusher and a group hugger, and all that is just there. It's part of the human way forward. And I think I want to ask you about this in the context of the way this issue has been framed for the last 30 years as kind of solved the climate crisis, as I said earlier, a pollution problem. Or it seems to me, just as an objective journalist looking at this stuff, that it's a much more emergent phenomenon. And there'll never be a department of climate change. But it's like, when you think about issues, the difference between a problem to solve and an issue you deal with is that a problem to solve is something discrete. But an issue, we have a Department of Labor that didn't exist 30 or 40 years ago, Department of Education that didn't. So issues emerge and new discussions emerge that are perennial. So is this a problem to solve, or is this an issue that is part of our future going forward as a species?
It will be both, but where I come at this, it's a problem to be solved. And for me, the debate over clean energy dwarfs the very real concerns about risk management that we have. And because of this development, we are focusing on the be-all solution to cut our emissions, very important to do, and not thinking about how do we remain economically vibrant in the face of successive impacts from climate change. So just think about what you read this summer with Phoenix. Airports shut down. In Washington, D.C., we've had planes stuck on the tarmac. Most of our freight is projected to continue to increase. It goes by rail. You have extreme heat events, sun kinks in the rails. The steel just can't handle the heat, and trains derail. Virtually none of our building codes reflect the future risk of climate change. Right. Virtually none of our current infrastructure being constructed, unless there was a very forward-thinking person involved, reflects future risk. So I don't know how many of you have gone over the Bay Bridge, in the beautiful new Bay Bridge. didn't take into account sea level rise. Already, they have to make adjustments for sea level rise. You can find that example at any place across the United States. So for me, there are concrete things we can do now, and we get lost in, not lost, but we get very concerned about our energy sources, extremely important. But let's not forget that we are making choices right now that leave us highly vulnerable to what we're trying to stop by changing our energy uses.
For sure. Bina, what do you think about that? Is this a problem to solve, or is this a relationship to build with the climate system?
I think it was really interesting the way you put it by describing that we don't have a Department of Climate Change. I actually think it would be a mistake to have a Department of Climate Change.
Me too.
A grave mistake.
I wouldn't want to work there.
And part of the reason is, I think, and you look at the polling and how people respond to the issue of climate change. It turns out the majority of Americans actually think this is a problem and care about it, but how they rank it on their hierarchy of concerns is, sixth below the economy and health and so on and so forth. But the reality is that climate change is not a little silo issue where you're imagining parts per million in the atmosphere or polar bears on thin ice or, even the impacts you might be seeing in the city of Miami if you live in Miami. It's a threat multiplier for all of the core issues we care about. It threatens our economy. It's trillions of dollars. It threatens our national security. It certainly is already threatening our health. And so I think the way that people can come into the door of caring about this problem, there should be multiple doors, I guess, is what I believe, and multiple ways to address both the impacts and really also to address the sources of the problem. When we talk about mitigating the emissions from climate change, that's where I think it breaks down a little bit, right? Because we come back to this sort of core source of the problem, which is that we're emitting too much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And if you're coming at it from a perspective of let's manage the risk to the city of Miami, you might not end up in the place where you work on that emissions problem. You might just stay at the level where you're working on how you think about zoning and how you think about real estate and how you think about infrastructure. But that might be okay, actually, because this transition to a new energy future, I think, can be pushed by other factors as well, and there's going to be other constituents that are pushing on it from that direction. And I think with India and China's leadership, yes, it's unfortunate for the U.S. to lose this position, but you're actually seeing that. You're seeing the air emissions in cities like Beijing and Delhi really driving emissions reductions, and China, peaking its emissions a decade earlier than was expected. India, the biggest coal company in India just announced that it's closing down 37 coal mines. And part of the driver of that is economic. Part of the driver is about public health, right? It's about these different avenues in. And I will say, just because this is such a dire conversation, that there's something really encouraging about that as well, because the U.S. path to development is not open to the rest of the world anymore if we want to solve this problem. But the Indian path to development might be, for example. So how are they going to electrify rural communities that are poor? And they're showing, hopefully, fingers crossed this is real, and there's there behind the Prime Minister's statements, but they're showing a potential path for that of energy transition and so forth. But I think of it as an issue to deal with over the course of many generations with many sub-problems that we have to deal with now.
Right. David, is there a positive thing that you see in the landscape, despite so many of these issues that have emerged that seem more a reason to pull your hair out? And it's time for you guys.
Yeah, we'll get some questions or go. The positive thing that I think that has happened, I tried occasionally, like you, try to write and express my thoughts about that very question. And about 2 years ago, I said last year would be the year that the U.S. awoke, that we became aware of climate change. And I think partly that happened both at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year in a different way for different reasons. And I think that we are now in a different place than we were even 2 years ago. I think we're still subject to a lot of confusion in this country about our energy and climate choices and what it means. And I don't think we've done a good enough job, either at the NGO or the academic or the scientific or the state level, of helping people understand why the change is occurring, what it might mean, and how much more of it to expect, without having to go too much more into the dire consequences of climate change. That's a reality. We have to understand and keep track of that. But at the same time, we have a lot of opportunities. We have a lot of opportunities both as consumers, and I think if the business community became more vocal about what's possible and what they see as needed, we might get there faster.
Okay. So I had some confusing signals. I thought we had time for questions, but it sounds like we do not.
We're done. Our next session will be at 3.
Okay. So I'm going to offer one little bit of positive thinking in a limited way. In 1985, before I was writing about global warming, I wrote the cover story for Science Digest magazine on nuclear winter, which was the idea that in the Cold War, if we burn enough cities, the atmosphere would fill with enough schmutz that it would chill the climate calamitously. Don't you love that cover? 3 years later, I wrote a cover story that had the Earth on a melting, like on a hot plate, about global warming. But here's the deal. In 1985, when I wrote this, guess how science magazines made their money?
Cigarettes.
And liquor on the back. But liquor, I could see. But this was a science magazine in 1985. So things can change. It takes time. This is a museum piece now. You should see the article with headlines about internet millionaires. So there's lots of room for things to change. Thank you for listening. Thank you guys for speaking.